What happens when a nation decides to physically block a US carrier strike group, knowing that one miscalculation could ignite a regional war? At 6:03 a.m., that question stopped being theoretical. The Caribbean Sea, usually quiet at sunrise, erupted into a scene that felt like the opening frame of an international crisis. 3 Venezuelan patrol ships tore across open water at 28 knots, their wakes slicing white scars through the blue as they angled directly toward the USS George Washington's bow. It wasn't posturing, it wasn't shadowing, it was an attempted blockade, bold, deliberate, and unmistakable. On the carrier's flight deck, time seemed to stall. The collision alarm blared, echoing across steel as crew members froze mid-motion, suddenly aware they were seconds away from confronting a challenge rarely seen in the Western Hemisphere. A $13 billion strike group found itself tested not by missiles or drones, but by something far older and far more dangerous national pride on collision course with American resolve. The Venezuelan flag snapped violently in the early wind red-blue-yellow flashes that told every sailor watching that this was no navigational misunderstanding. This was a wall, a message, a dare. The USS Gravely reacted first. Her turbines howled as she surged ahead, gray hull cutting through water with a speed that felt like a warning wrapped in steel. Her mission was unspoken but understood across every deck intercept posture and ensured that the US Navy did not so much as flinch. Deterrence through presence, a doctrine written not in textbooks but in moments exactly like this. Inside the Combat Information Center, tension curled through the air like wire drawn too tight. Radar crews tracked 3 fast contacts at 12 nautical miles closing. Their formation tight, disciplined, unwavering, signaled intent long before any radio transmission did. Officers spoke in clipped calm sentences, each word fighting to steady the rising adrenaline. The Venezuelan ships held a shallow V formation angled to cross directly in front of the carrier's planned path. It was geometry weaponized seamanship used as a form of strategic coercion. Above on the flight deck, the MH-60R Seahawk snapped to readiness. Tie-downs flew off, rotors flexed, crew members moved with the kind of controlled urgency that only comes from years of training for a crisis no one hopes to see. When the intercom cut through the chaos, they're trying to block us, nobody doubted it. The Seahawk lifted off moments later, vanishing into humid haze as a set of eyes, sensors, and silent warnings. Yet the carrier itself did not budge. No course change, no reduction in speed. Maintaining heading in a moment like this is not stubbornness, it is strategy. In naval language, holding steady is the loudest statement a superpower can make. Freedom of navigation does not yield to intimidation. The Venezuelan vessel surged closer, slicing the sea with defiance. And with each passing second, the question grew sharper: would Caracas truly push through with a maneuver that risked a catastrophic collision, or would the US call their bluff and force them to blink? The instant the Venezuelan vessels pressed deeper into the strike group's path, the USS Gravely transformed from escort to shield. Her turbines screamed at near maximum output, pulling the destroyer ahead in a gray blur of momentum. The deck trembled under the strain, yet her movements were precise, every degree of her turn calculated to convey strength without triggering catastrophe. The 5-inch Mark 45 gun rotated deliberately toward the threat, not aiming, not locking, simply showing. Visibility, not aggression. Posture, not provocation. Intense naval encounters, restraint becomes its own form of dominance. Inside the Gravely's Combat Information Center, radar tones pulsed like a quickening heartbeat. 3 contacts now inside 10 nautical miles maintained 28 knots with unnerving discipline. Officers reviewed rules of engagement, confirming that the strike group would remain within the boundaries of international law. No one wanted escalation. No one wanted misinterpretation. Yet the Venezuelan formation, tight, assertive, and closing, forced the destroyer into a role the world rarely sees: a wall of steel inserted between a carrier and a reckless maneuver that could shatter diplomatic stability across the Americas. The communications officer broadcast a clear, measured warning across open channels: unidentified Venezuelan naval vessels. This is a United States warship operating in international waters. You are crossing a restricted formation. Alter course immediately. The message carried the weight of both legality and expectation. Venezuela offered no reply. The silence, more than anything, sharpened the mood. Tension settled into every console, every headset, every breath. From above, the MH-60R Seahawk banked south rotors, slicing through humid air as its FLIR pod locked onto the advancing hulls. The helicopter wasn't armed for battle. Its weapons remained cold, but its surveillance capabilities were unmatched. High-resolution thermal video streamed into the Gravely systems, revealing crisp outlines of the Venezuelan Caribbean-class patrol ships. Even without radar locks or aggressive emissions, their posture screamed intent. They were not escorting. They were not monitoring. They were positioning themselves to obstruct a carrier strike group deployed under President Trump's 2025 national security posture, one defined by assertive freedom of navigation operations and a zero-tolerance approach to maritime coercion. On board the carrier, USS George Washington, the Combat Direction Center watched the geometry shift in slow, alarming increments. Three red icons moved with unwavering confidence toward the heart of the strike group. The carrier's decks hummed with restrained readiness. Flight crews stood by catapults powered but cold jets secured but capable of rapid launch if the situation crossed an invisible line. No one believed missiles would fly, but no one forgot that miscalculations at sea tend to rewrite history in seconds. The destroyer USS Gravely surged tighter along the carrier's flank, cutting across its bow like a guard dog sliding into defensive position. The sea boiled white behind her, and her presence alone forced the Venezuelan formation to reconsider its geometry. Still, the patrol craft pressed forward, their bows angled in defiant clarity. On deck, sailors gripped railings, watching silhouettes grow larger against the dawn. Bridge reports crackled through contacts, now within 8.6 nautical miles. Bearing steady, speed unchanged. The captain's reply was calm, almost surgical. Maintain intercept posture. No targeting. Let them see us. Discipline again was the weapon. By the time the Seahawk relayed its first close-range imagery, clear visuals of uncovered missile pods on the Venezuelan decks, the situation had escalated from a risky approach to a calculated provocation. The destroyer kept her bow locked forward, refusing deviation. Freedom of navigation was not merely a policy, it was the backbone of American naval credibility. The battle lines were invisible but unmistakable, and both sides knew that a single wrong move could turn this dawn confrontation into the first major naval crisis of 2025. As the two forces closed distance, the sea became a map of intention. Every shift of wake, every fractional degree of heading broadcast a message clearer than radio traffic ever could. The Venezuelan patrol craft expanded their shallow V formation, turning it into a deliberate barrier of steel placed directly across the carrier strike group's path. The geometry was unmistakable. This was not harassment. This was an attempted blockade executed at high speed and with calculated coordination. It was the kind of maneuver designed not merely to challenge US presence, but to test whether Washington under President Trump's assertive 2025 military posture would yield even an inch of navigational freedom in the Caribbean. On board the USS Gravely, the Combat Information Center processed radar sweeps faster than operators could voice them. Range now 5.4 nautical miles, a tactical officer announced his voice tight despite years of training. The response weapons visible only. Do not paint targets. This order served two purposes. It maintained US adherence to lawful defensive conduct, and it ensured the Venezuelans knew exactly what they were approaching. The Mark 45 gun's deliberate pivot, the phalanx CIWS spinning its barrels to idle speed, the Seahawk's circling silhouette overhead, each element formed part of a silent wall that said the strike group would not yield. The MH-60R's FLIR camera painted the blockade attempt in stark contrast. The Venezuelan hulls glowed white in infrared exhaust plumes rising like warnings. The flight crew's report cut clean through radiostatic 3 patrol craft in blockade posture. Speed 27 knots. Formation steady. From 600 feet every detail, missile pods, deck movement flag angles became evidence of intent. Their bows sliced forward not with confusion, but confidence. Inside the carrier's Combat Direction Center, the situation looked like a slow-motion collision plotted across glowing screens. Geopolitically, it carried implications far beyond a Caribbean standoff. In Europe, Russian naval units in the Black Sea had pushed similar boundary lines against NATO surveillance aircraft. In the Middle East, Iranian fast attack craft routinely challenged US vessels near the Strait of Hormuz. In the Pacific, Chinese maritime militias executed gray zone pressure tactics to force American ships off routine transits. And now Venezuela, backed politically and economically by both Moscow and Beijing, appeared to be testing Washington's resolve in its own hemisphere. The Gravely's captain leaned into the console, eyes fixed on the closing geometry. Bow through them, he ordered quietly. Not collision, not aggression, but a commitment to remain on course, forcing the Venezuelans to decide whether their threat was symbolic or real. At 3.8 nautical miles, the Venezuelan lead ship transmitted its first warning. "You are entering our security zone. Alter course immediately." The reply from the US destroyer was calm and immovable. Negative. Operating lawfully in international waters under UNCLOS. Maintain safe separation. The legal clarity left no room for ambiguity. Tension vibrated across steel bulkheads. Electro-warfare teams monitored emissions. No targeting radar detected, but surface search radar is painting us. A reminder that even without fire control locks, aggressive scanning carried psychological weight. The Phalanx's slow pivot shone under rising sunlight, a metallic whisper of capability. Then came the test of nerve. At 3.4 nautical miles, the Venezuelan formation shifted again, placing their bows on a line nearly parallel with the Gravely's path. Wake against wake, hull against hull, pride against pressure. For 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes, neither side yielded. Finally, the change appeared. The Venezuelan engines throttled down, slipping from 28 to 20 knots. Their formation loosened, their posture eased, geometry relaxed. The blockade had cracked. The moment Venezuelan throttles eased back, the near collision in the Caribbean shifted from a physical standoff to a geopolitical echo, because what happened at sunrise off Curacao did not exist in isolation. In 2025, the world is a lattice of confrontations, each crisis reflecting another, each regional dispute feeding into a broader struggle over prestige, deterrence, and the limits of military pressure. And as the Venezuelan patrol craft drifted from aggression to observation, the same question that haunts other flashpoints loomed over this one. How far can a smaller state push a superpower before the line snaps? Analysts across Washington immediately drew parallels to Ukraine. In the Black Sea, Russia had spent years using small, fast vessels to intimidate NATO ships, enforcing freedom of navigation. Patrol boats swarmed reconnaissance aircraft. Coastal missile batteries lit up radars. Each action was calibrated to test Western restraint without sparking open conflict. The Venezuelan maneuver mirrored the same philosophy used compact, agile platforms to force a confrontation that places political risk on the stronger party. The difference: in this case, the stronger party was a U.S. carrier strike group, a symbol of national resolve under President Trump's security doctrine, which promised that American access to international waters would not bend to authoritarian pressure. The Middle East offered another parallel. In the Strait of Hormuz, Iranian fast attack craft regularly executed blockade-style maneuvers against US and allied ships. These encounters often escalated quickly, as missile silhouettes and radar emissions risked triggering defensive responses. The Venezuelan use of uncovered missile pods identified through Seahawk FLIR imagery fit that same pattern, a strategic gamble that visibility alone could coerce adjustment. But as in the Gulf, miscalculations can turn choreography into catastrophe. One unexpected turn, one misinterpreted radar pulse, and a standoff becomes a flashpoint with global repercussions. Then there was the Pacific. China's pressure on US vessels in the South China Sea increasingly relied on gray zone tactics, a mixture of naval militia boats, Coast Guard cutters, and shadowing destroyers moving in layered formations to intimidate lawful transits. Beijing's playbook influenced partners and allies across the world, and Venezuela, backed diplomatically by both China and Russia, appeared eager to imitate the same assertive posture. The three-ship V formation, the refusal to answer initial US, hails the claim of a security zone extending beyond lawful territorial seas, all aligned with tactics China regularly employs to challenge American influence and international maritime norms. The Venezuelan move, therefore, was not an isolated burst of bravado. It was part of a global pattern in which regional actors test the boundaries of superpower tolerance to score strategic points at home and abroad. Caracas aimed to project defiant signal independence and earn political capital from allies who prefer a world where US power is contested. Yet the risk was enormous. A carrier strike group is not a negotiable symbol. It is the physical embodiment of American deterrence. And in 2025, with President Trump reinforcing an image of uncompromising maritime presence, any attempt to impede that presence carries consequences far beyond a single morning at sea. As the Venezuelan ships slowed, one truth became harder to ignore this standoff brief as it was revealed just how thin the margin for error has become. Around the world, militaries are testing the limits of ambiguity, pushing close enough to provoke, but not enough to trigger open war. The Caribbean had now joined the catalog of pressure points stretching from Kharkiv to Hormuz, from the Spratlys to the shores of South America. And the question lingered, if a confrontation like this can unfold without warning in America's own hemisphere, how many more global flashpoints are one misunderstanding away from the next international crisis? Long before analysts compared satellite images or policymakers drafted statements, the confrontation in the Caribbean was felt most viscerally by the people who stood closest to danger. On the decks of the USS Gravely and the USS George Washington sailors braced against railings as the Venezuelan hulls grew larger on the horizon. It wasn't the threat of missiles or gunfire that tightened throats, it was the possibility of a collision at 20 knots, a blunt force disaster that could kill dozens before either side had time to blink. Moments like these strip geopolitics down to bone and breath. The world debates strategy, the crew feels consequences. Inside the Gravely's Combat Information Center, the air vibrated with overlapping murmurs, bearing updates, speed calls, radar sweeps. Young operators, some only months into their first deployment, watched 3 red icons moving toward them in patterns usually reserved for simulation drills. Except this time, the danger wasn't hypothetical. A Venezuelan formation executed a real-world blockade posture, and every sailor in that dimly lit room understood that a misinterpreted signal could unleash outcomes far beyond their control. Meanwhile, on the Venezuelan patrol boats, crews experienced a different strain of tension. They faced the silhouette of a US destroyer, one of the most capable surface combatants on Earth, closing fast. Above them, the MH-60R Seahawk circled its FLIR lens, glinting like a silent judge. Though Caracas pushed the narrative of sovereignty and resistance, the sailors on those decks were acutely aware of the stakes. They were operating in a domain where the smallest mistake could be fatal. Their families back home would hear only reports of patriotic duty. They, however, stared directly at the possibility of escalation with a nation whose naval power dwarfed theirs. The human dimension grew sharper as the distances shrank. On the Gravely, the Phalanx CIWS spun at idle barrels gleaming in the sunrise. Its soft mechanical hum carried a terrifying implication: it was ready. Sailors nearby gripped their harnesses, steadying themselves not against fear, but against uncertainty. Everyone knew the Phalanx could unleash 4,500 rounds per minute. Everyone knew it was designed to protect them, and everyone prayed it would stay silent. The Seahawk aircrew orbiting above at carefully managed altitude bore its own psychological weight. They watched the blockade unfold in real time, interpreting body language on foreign decks, analyzing exhaust plumes, tracking minute heading changes. Each decision: tighten orbit, widen, sweep, adjust angle, had to be perfect. A misjudged movement could be interpreted as aggression, and so they flew with discipline bordering on devotion, narrating every detail back to the Gravely with steady voices that masked the severity of what they saw. Even aboard the carrier, where thousands of personnel were removed from the immediate line of collision, the tension settled deep. Flight deck crews, often accustomed to the controlled chaos of jet operations, stood poised without launching a single aircraft. They watched from behind safety nets as the Gravely carved a protective line ahead of the carrier, aware that their own lives depended on the destroyer's precision. Every sailor who glanced toward the horizon understood the unspoken truth: diplomacy was now playing out in steel and wake lines. And on both sides, one shared thought lingered beneath the adrenaline: if someone makes the wrong move, none of us are going home the same. This is the human cost at the center of modern geopolitics: young men and women carrying the weight of decisions made in capital cities, holding their breath while the world holds its balance. And when the Venezuelan throttles finally eased and the threat began to recede, the relief was quiet, internal, and immense. No cheering, no celebration, just an exhale carried away by the Caribbean wind. But the question that haunted every sailor remained: if this close call unfolded without warning at dawn, how many more moments like this are waiting just beyond the horizon? When the Venezuelan patrol craft finally eased their throttles and veered east-southeast, the standoff did not simply end, it transformed into a message. A message for Caracas, for Washington, and for every nation, watching how the United States responds when freedom of navigation is challenged in its own hemisphere. The encounter had begun as a dramatic attempt to force a U.S. carrier strike group to alter course. It ended as a lesson in strategic patience, precision, and posture. For all its intensity, no missile launched, no gun fired, no hulls collided. In a world world edging toward miscalculation, that restraint was its own quiet victory. By the time the USS George Washington resumed standard formation at 6:30 a.m., the Caribbean looked serene again, but beneath the calm surface, the geopolitical undercurrents churned. For the Venezuelan leadership, the attempted blockade was political theater, a symbolic gesture meant to project defiance and domestic strength. Yet the decision to break off first revealed the limits of that posture. Caracas stepped back because the cost of pushing forward was too high. Challenging a U.S. destroyer bearing down with unmistakable resolve risked creating an international crisis that Venezuela could neither control nor survive. In Washington, the Trump administration interpreted the incident as validation of its maritime strategy, decisive presence, unyielding navigation rights, and a global signal that U.S. carrier groups will not bow to coercion. The strike group's unwavering course was not just a navigational choice. It was a geopolitical declaration, one that allies applauded and adversaries noted with caution. It reaffirmed the idea that the United States, despite global pressures in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Pacific, remains prepared to enforce international norms with visible disciplined strength. The standoff also reinforced an uncomfortable truth for the world's militaries. In 2025, escalation thresholds have tightened. Regional powers, emboldened by great power competition, increasingly test boundaries to score political victories. Venezuela's attempted blockade echoed Russia's brinksmanship in the Black Sea, Iran's maritime pressure in the Gulf, and China's coercive tactics around contested reefs. Each episode employs the same logic use pressure short of war to challenge American influence. Each carries the same risk that one misstep will go too far. For U.S. sailors, the event left a deeper imprint. They watched an adversarial formation close in with risky confidence, knowing that their own discipline, not firepower, was the shield that kept the incident from exploding. The professionalism with which they held the line turned an attempted provocation into a demonstration of control. Hours later, flight deck crews returned to routine rotors, folded jets, secured logs filed. The sea shimmered in the morning sun, hiding the tension that had unfolded moments before. Yet the memory lingered in every watch rotation, every radar sweep, every conversation in the wardroom, because the message delivered that morning was clear: prestige is defended not only by force, but by the refusal to be pushed. And so the United States left the encounter with a renewed question, one that resonates far beyond the Caribbean. If challenges like these continue to rise around the world, how long can naval discipline alone prevent the next confrontation from becoming a crisis? And for viewers witnessing these events from afar, a final thought emerges: if moments like this matter to you, stay engaged, subscribe, and help us follow every turning point in a world growing more uncertain by the day. At dawn in the Caribbean, Venezuela attempted a high-risk maneuver, blocking a U.S. carrier strike group moving in international waters. 3 fast patrol ships surged into a blockade posture, forcing the USS Gravely and the USS George Washington into a tense confrontation that unfolded in seconds but carried global implications. Through calm discipline, precise maneuvering, and visible deterrence, not aggressive targeting, the U.S. Navy held course and refused to yield. The Venezuelan formation, after closing dangerously to within a few nautical miles, eventually throttled back and abandoned its attempted obstruction. The standoff mirrored a broader pattern seen in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the South China Sea, where smaller states test superpowers through high-pressure maritime encounters. In 2025, under President Trump's assertive security policy, the U.S. response demonstrated that freedom of navigation remains non-negotiable. Yet the human dimension of the event, young sailors watching a potential collision unfold, highlighted the tension between global strategy and personal risk. In the end, the crisis ended without a shot fired, but its message was unmistakable. Naval discipline can prevent war, but it cannot erase the growing number of actors willing to push the limits. Will the next confrontation end as peacefully?